The night they killed Cale Darrow, the sky above Salt Creek, Nebraska was the color of a wound. No stars, no moon. Just a thick, pressing darkness that sat over the land, like it had been waiting for something terrible to happen. Nora Voss heard the shots from inside the house, 3 of them, clean and deliberate, and she knew before she even reached the door. She knew the way you know when something precious has slipped from your hands, and you hear it shatter on the floor below. Her feet were bare on the cold wooden planks. Her hair was loose, and when she threw open the door and saw the torches moving in the field below the hill, she made a sound she had never made before in her life. Not a scream. Something quieter. Something that came from a place inside her that had no name. She ran. She ran through the tall grass in the dark, and the blades cut at her ankles, and she did not stop. Because Cale was down there, and the men with the torches were her father's men. She found him face down in the grass, 20 yards from the old fence post where they used to meet. She turned him over herself. His chest was still warm. His eyes were open, looking up at that starless sky like he was searching for something he had been promised. Nora pressed both hands against him and called his name twice, then once more in a whisper, as if the third time might work differently. It did not. Around her, boots moved through the grass. Torches crackled, and then a heavy hand landed on her shoulder, familiar, gentle, the hand that had tucked her in as a child, and she heard her father's voice say her name softly. She did not turn around. She could not look at him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She shrugged his hand off her shoulder like it was something that had burned her, and she stayed there in the grass with Cale until the torches finally went quiet, and the night swallowed every sound except her breathing. Before we go any further, if this story is already pulling at something inside you, you're not alone. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one. You're not just a viewer, you're part of how this story lives. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what Nora did next, you need to understand who Cale Darrow was, and why an entire town was afraid to say his name out loud. Cale Darrow rode into Salt Creek on a Tuesday morning in early October, and by Wednesday, everybody knew his name. Not because he introduced himself, not because he shook hands or tipped his hat at the general store. They knew his name because of what he did to Roy Petch. Roy was a broad-shouldered cattle broker who had a habit of cheating small farmers out of their land payments and laughing about it afterward in the saloon. Most people in Salt Creek had swallowed that laugh for years, because Roy had money and Roy had connections, and in a town like Salt Creek, that was the same thing as being untouchable. Cale had been in town less than 18 hours when he walked into that saloon, sat down across from Roy mid-laugh, and put Roy's face into the table so hard the wood cracked. He didn't say a word before. He didn't say a word after. He just stood up, adjusted his coat, and walked back out into the October dust like he had simply finished a meal. The saloon was dead silent for a long moment. Then someone whispered his name, and it stuck. He was not a large man in the way that made people stare. He was lean, sharp at the jaw, with dark eyes that moved slowly and missed nothing. He wore a gray duster that had seen too many miles and boots that were cracked at the left heel. His horse was a dark brown mare he called Nothing, at least nothing anyone ever heard. He kept to himself at the edge of town, in a broken-down boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Aldine, who was either too brave or too tired to turn him away. In the weeks that followed, stories gathered around Cale Darrow, the way dust gathered around everything else in Nebraska, quietly, completely, until you couldn't remember what anything looked like before it arrived. And they said he had killed a man in Ogallala over a card game. They said he had burned a ranch to the ground in his younger years. They said Sheriff Edmund Voss had been watching him since the day he arrived, waiting for a reason. Most of those stories were half-true at best, but in Salt Creek, half-true was enough to make a man dangerous, and dangerous was enough to make a man alone. Nora Voss was not the kind of woman men forgot easily. She was tall for her time, with dark red hair that she kept pinned up during the day and loose at night, and gray eyes that had a way of looking at you like she was already 3 steps ahead of whatever you were about to say. She had grown up in Salt Creek, which meant she had grown up watching her father carry the weight of the town on his shoulders. The disputes, the drunks, the debts, on the occasional body that needed explaining. She understood power. She understood fear. And unlike most of the women in Salt Creek, she had never confused the two. She helped Mrs. Aldine with supply runs on Thursdays. She read to the younger children at the church on Sunday mornings. She was kind without being soft, and quiet without being invisible. Every eligible man in Salt Creek had noticed her at some point. Most of them had also noticed the way Sheriff Edmund Voss cleaned his rifle on the porch every evening, and had decided that noticing was enough. She first saw Cale Darrow on a Thursday morning outside the general store. He was leaning against the post with his arms crossed, watching the street with those slow, dark eyes, and every person who walked past him crossed to the other side without seeming to realize they were doing it. Ma Nora noticed that. She noticed the way the whole street bent around him like water around a rock. She stopped walking and looked at him directly, not with fear, not with curiosity exactly, but with the careful attention she gave to things she did not yet understand. He felt her looking. He turned his head and met her eyes. Neither of them looked away immediately. It lasted only a few seconds, but in a town as small as Salt Creek, a few seconds was long enough to mean something. Nora picked up her basket and kept walking. Cale watched her go, but he didn't know why he was still looking. He started showing up where she was. Not in an obvious way. Cale Darrow was too careful for obvious. But Nora noticed. She noticed him at the edge of the Thursday market, pretending to examine a saddle while she picked out flour and dried beans. She noticed him outside the church on a Sunday morning, sitting on his horse across the street, not quite watching and not quite looking away. She said nothing about it. She didn't tell her father. She didn't mention it to Mrs. Aldine, who would have made it into something loud and public before sundown. She just filed it away in the back of her mind, the way she filed everything. Quietly, carefully, waiting to understand what it meant before she decided what to do about it. Well, one afternoon she was walking back from the creek with an empty water pail when she heard boots on the gravel path behind her. She didn't quicken her pace. She didn't slow down either. She just kept walking until his footsteps were close enough that it would have been strange not to acknowledge them. She turned around. He stopped. They stood there in the late afternoon light, 5 feet apart, and neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. "You keep showing up," she said. Not an accusation, just a fact, stated plainly, the way she stated most things. Cale looked at her for a moment. "Free country," he said. Nora almost smiled. Almost. "It is," she agreed. She picked up her pail and turned back toward town. "Try not to frighten anyone on your way back." Cale surprisingly found himself smiling. Nora didn't look behind her again, but she was listening for his footsteps, and she heard them stay exactly where they were, still and quiet, long after she had rounded the corner. Over the days that followed, something shifted between them that neither of them named. He stopped pretending he wasn't watching. She stopped pretending she hadn't noticed. Their conversations were short and careful at first. A sentence here, a word there, the kind of exchanges that meant very little on the surface and everything underneath. Cale was not a man who talked easily, but Nora had a way of asking questions that didn't feel like questions, and before long, he was saying things he hadn't said out loud in years. Small things. Real things. The kind that cost something to admit. Salt Creek watched all of this with narrow eyes. And on the porch of the sheriff's office, Edmund Voss cleaned his rifle and said nothing. But his jaw was tight, and his eyes never left the edge of town where Cale Darrow's lamplight burned long after midnight. It was Nora who suggested the creek. Not directly. She was never direct about things like that. She mentioned one afternoon, almost to herself, that the bend in Salt Creek just past the old Harmon property was quieter than anywhere else in town. That the cottonwood trees there blocked the wind, and the water ran clear even in October. She said it the way you say something you don't expect anyone to act on. Cale acted on it. 2 days later, she walked down to that bend in the late afternoon and found him already there, and sitting on a flat rock with his boots off and his feet in the cold water, like he had been there 100 times before. She stopped at the tree line. He didn't turn around. "Figured you'd come," he said. Nora set down her shawl on a dry rock and sat a few feet away from him. The creek moved between them and around them, and the cottonwoods caught the last of the afternoon light and held it gold and still above their heads. For a while, neither of them spoke. In Salt Creek, silence between two people usually meant discomfort. Between Cale and Nora, it meant something else entirely. It meant they had run out of reasons to pretend. It was there, by that creek, that he told her the first real thing about himself. Not the stories the town told, not the card games or the burned ranch or the man in Ogallala. Something quieter. He told her he had not slept in a bed with a roof he trusted in 11 years, that he had spent so long being what people expected him to be that he couldn't always remember what he had been before. Nora listened without interrupting, which was the greatest gift she could have given him. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, watching the water. Then she said, "What were you before?" He looked at her sideways. Nobody had ever asked him that. He thought about it for longer than she expected. "Smaller," he finally said, "and a lot less tired." Nora looked at the creek and nodded slowly, like that made perfect sense. The sun dropped behind the tree line. The air went cold quickly the way Nebraska air does in October. Neither of them moved to leave. And in the fading light, with the water running quiet beside them, Cale Darrow felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly, something rarer than that. The feeling that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Edmund Voss was not a cruel man. That was the part that made everything harder. He was a man who had buried a wife, raised a daughter alone in a rough town, and kept Salt Creek from tearing itself apart for nearly 2 decades, with nothing but a badge and a reputation for fairness. He loved Nora, the way only a father who has lost everything else can love a child. Completely. Desperately. And sometimes in ways that looked nothing like love from the outside. He had watched her grow from a quiet, serious little girl into a woman who was sharper and steadier than most men he knew. He was proud of her in a way he never quite found the words for. And because he loved her that way, that completely, that desperately, the sight of Cale Darrow anywhere near her made something cold and certain settle in his chest. He had seen men like Cale before. He knew how their stories ended. He was not going to let his daughter become part of one. He started gathering information quietly. He sent a letter to the sheriff in Ogallala. He spoke to Roy Petch, whose pride still hadn't recovered from the saloon incident, and who was more than willing to talk. He spoke to 2 ranch hands who had crossed paths with Cale in his earlier years, men passing through Salt Creek, who recognized the name and had things to say about it. What Edmund assembled was not a pretty picture, A man with a trail of trouble behind him stretching back nearly 15 years. No permanent home, no family, no future that anyone could point to. A man who had spent his whole life taking up space in other people's towns and moving on before the consequences caught up with him. Edmund sat with all of this for 3 days. Then he made a decision. He would not confront Cale directly. Not yet. That would only push Nora closer to him. He knew his daughter. She did not respond well to being told what to do. No, he would be smarter than that. He would be patient. He would wait for the right moment. And when it came, he would end this cleanly and quietly, before it went any further. He told himself he was protecting her. He told himself any father would do the same. He almost believed it. The night Cale told Nora about the place, it was cold enough to see their breath. They were sitting on the hill above the old fence post, the same hill where they had started meeting when the creek became too exposed, too easy for eyes to find them. Nora had brought a blanket. Kyle had brought nothing, the way he always did, as if arriving empty-handed was a habit he had never thought to break. The stars were out in full that night, the kind of Nebraska sky that made you feel small and held at the same time. They had been sitting quietly for a while when Cale spoke without being asked. That was still rare enough that Nora went still and listened carefully. He told her about a place he had passed through once, years ago, riding south out of Nebraska into the Texas Panhandle, a stretch of land outside a small town called Claude. Flat open fields that caught the morning light in a way that made everything look like it was made of gold. A stream that ran clean and quiet through the property. A tree, a big cottonwood, standing close to an old barn like it had been keeping watch for decades. He had stopped his horse there and sat for a long time without knowing why. He had never owned anything, had never wanted to. But standing in that field, he had felt something pull at him that he didn't have a word for. Nora listened to all of it without moving. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed, softly, not unkindly, the way you laugh at something that surprises you with how much it moves you. "That's your dream?" she said. "A tree and a stream?" Cale looked at her sideways. "And the light," he said, completely serious. She laughed again. And this time, he almost smiled, which for Caldera was as close to laughter as he ever got. But then she stopped laughing and looked at him with those gray eyes that saw too much. And she asked him quietly if he ever thought he would go back there. The almost smile faded. He looked out at the dark Nebraska field below them and was quiet for a long time. "Men like me don't end up in places like that," he said. "Men like me end up in Ogallala." Nora knew what Ogallala meant. Everybody in Nebraska knew what Ogallala meant. It was where the nameless ones went, the ones nobody claimed. She wanted to argue with him. She wanted to tell him he was wrong. But something in the way he said it, flat and certain, like a man reciting a fact he had long since made his peace with, stopped the words before they reached her mouth, and she looked at the stars instead. And she made a private promise to herself that she did not say out loud. Edmund Voss set everything in motion on a Friday. He did it carefully, the way he did most things, without rushing, without showing his hand. He told Nora that he had invited a few of the town's respected men for supper that Saturday evening. A small gathering, nothing formal. He mentioned casually, almost as an afterthought, that she was welcome to invite anyone she felt comfortable with. He watched her face when he said it. He saw the small hesitation, the flicker of something she tried to hide. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. Nora was careful, but she was also in love, and love has a way of making careful people take risks they would otherwise never consider. She sent word to Cale through a note left under the flat rock by the creek, their system, simple and private. She told him it was just supper, that her father was making an effort, that maybe this was the opening they had been waiting for. Cale stared at that note for a long time. Every instinct he had developed over 15 years of surviving told him something was wrong. The problem was that Nora was the first thing in 15 years that had felt right. And a man who has been cold long enough will walk toward warmth even when he knows he shouldn't. He came on Saturday evening. Clean shirt, hair pushed back, boots without the usual dust. Mrs. Aldine had looked at him when he left and said nothing, which from her was the same as saying everything. The supper was quiet and stiff in the way that forced politeness always is. Edmund was courteous, almost warm. He asked Cale reasonable questions about ranching and land and the road south, and Cale answered them in the short, careful way he answered everything. Nora sat across the table and watched her father with the attention she gave to things she didn't yet understand. Something felt slightly off to her, a note just barely out of tune, but she couldn't name it, and so she let it go. After supper, Edmund poured 2 glasses of whiskey and suggested Cale stay a while longer. Kyle looked at Nora. She gave him the smallest nod. He stayed. And outside in the dark, beyond the warm light of the Voss house, 3 of Edmund's most trusted deputies were already moving into position, quiet and patient, the way men move when they have been told exactly where to wait and exactly how long. They left the Voss house just after 10. Cale and Nora walked together through the dark toward the hill, their hill, the one above the old fence post, because neither of them was ready for the evening to end. The air was sharp and cold, and the grass was silver under the starlight. Kyle was quieter than usual, which was saying something. Nora walked close enough that their arms touched. She could feel the tension in him, that old animal awareness that never fully left his body, even in his most relaxed moments. She thought it was just Kyle being Kyle. She didn't know it was his instincts sending him a message he had chosen, for the first time in his life, to ignore. They sat on the hill for a long time. Cale talked more than he usually did, about the road south, about the Texas Panhandle, about what it might feel like to wake up in the same place 2 mornings in a row and not feel the need to leave. Nora listened and said very little, because she understood that he was not really talking about Texas. He was talking about her, about them, about something neither of them had said out loud yet, but that was sitting right there between them, solid and real as the ground beneath them. When he finally went quiet, she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he let her, which from Kyle was the same as a declaration. What happened after belonged only to them. But afterward, in the deep quiet of the night, Kyle lay on his back and looked up at the stars and told her everything. Not the stories the town told, the real things, where he had come from, a small town east of Ogallala, where his father had left a debt so large it had swallowed their family whole. How he had been 7 years old when the men first came to collect. How his mother had held them off for 9 more years before the weight of it finally broke her. How he had left at 18 with nothing but the clothes on his back and an anger so deep it had taken years to find the bottom of it. He told her about the mistakes, the real ones, the ones that kept him awake. And then, in a voice so quiet she had to lean in to hear it, he told her about Claude, Texas one more time. The stream, the tree, the light. That's where I'd want to end up, he said. Not Ogallala, somewhere like that. Nora pressed her hand flat against his chest and felt his heartbeat slow and steady beneath her palm. She opened her mouth to tell him something important, something she had been holding for weeks. But before the words came, a sound split the night open, a torch, then another, then boots in the grass, moving fast from 3 directions at once. Cale was on his feet before she could blink, every instinct firing at once. But it was already too late. They had waited for exactly this moment. And Edmund Voss had known his daughter well enough to know exactly when it would come. The torches came from 3 directions at once. Cale saw them before he heard the boots. 3 points of orange light moving through the dark grass below the hill, spreading wide and deliberate like men who had been told exactly where to position themselves and had followed those instructions carefully. He was on his feet in an instant, every nerve in his body firing at once. 15 years of survival instinct overriding everything else in a single heartbeat. Nora grabbed his arm. He pulled her behind him without thinking, putting himself between her and the light. His hand went to his hip and found what he already knew would be there. He had come to supper at the Voss house. He had come clean and careful and unarmed, because Nora had asked him to, and because, for the first time in his life, he had wanted to be the kind of man who could do that. That decision was now going to cost him everything. The torches stopped moving. A voice came out of the dark, steady, authoritative, the voice of a man who had spent 20 years making people listen to it. Edmund Voss, not shouting, almost gentle. He told Cale to put his hands where his men could see them. He told him it didn't have to be difficult. Cale stood completely still on that hill, with Nora's hand gripping his arm, and the torchlight painting long shadows across the grass, and he understood with absolute clarity that there was no version of this night that ended well for him. He went down fighting anyway. That was who he was. And he took the first deputy with his bare hands, a big man named Cord, who came up the hill fast and confident, and found out quickly that confidence without caution is just noise. Cale put him down in 3 seconds flat, and took his sidearm and used it to buy himself enough space to breathe. He was fast, faster than any of them expected, which told him Edmund had underestimated him, which meant Edmund had never truly watched him the way Nora had. But there were 4 of them, and the hill was surrounded, and Coyle had been awake for 18 hours and had spent the last several of them letting his guard down further than he had let it drop in over a decade. He took a hit to the side that bent him double. He straightened and kept moving. He took another across the shoulder that spun him but didn't stop him. Nora was screaming somewhere behind him, his name, over and over, the sound of it cutting through everything else. He did not look back at her. He couldn't afford to look back. Looking back was how you died. And then the 3rd shot came. Lower. Final. The kind that doesn't leave room for argument. And Cale Darrow's legs stopped working, and the Nebraska ground came up to meet him, and the gun fell out of his hand into the grass. He heard boots around him. He heard Nora's voice break in a way that he felt in his chest even then. He was face down in the cold grass, and the torchlight was orange and wavering above him, and the stars were somewhere up past all of that. And he thought about a cottonwood tree standing near an old barn in the Texas Panhandle, with the morning light moving slow and gold across a quiet field. He thought about that for as long as he could. And then the thinking stopped. They buried arguments with Nora the next morning. Edmund came to her room at dawn, his hat in his hands, his eyes carrying the particular heaviness of a man who has done something he cannot undo and knows it. He told her it had to be done, that Cale was dangerous, that she would understand someday when the grief had thinned enough to let reason back in. Nora sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her father, really looked at him, and saw something she had never seen on his face before. Not confidence, not authority. Fear. He was afraid of losing her. He had been afraid of it from the moment he saw her looking at Cale Darrow outside the general store, and that fear had led him to do the one thing most guaranteed to make it happen. She understood all of that. She even felt something close to pity for him. But understanding a wound doesn't mean you let the person who gave it to you keep standing in your house. She told him quietly that she needed him to leave her room. He stood there a moment longer, hat turning slowly in his hands. Then he left. She listened to his footsteps move down the hall, and she sat in the silence he left behind, and she let herself feel the full weight of everything. The grief, the fury, the love that had nowhere left to go. She let it move through her completely, and when it had passed, what remained was not emptiness. It was clarity. Cold and clean as creek water. She knew exactly what she was going to do. She buried Cale on the hill. Not in Ogallala, not in the town cemetery, not in any of the places the world would have chosen for a man like him. On the hill where they had sat under the stars, and he had told her the real things about himself. She did it with the help of two men, old Garrett, who ran the livery stable and had privately respected Cale for reasons he never explained, and a quiet young ranch hand named Dex, who had once seen Cale stop 3 men from burning a farmer's field and had never forgotten it. Edmund watched from a distance. He did not try to stop her. Maybe he understood that this was the last thing she would ever do in Salt Creek, and he wanted to let her do it without a fight. Maybe he simply didn't have anything left in him. She drove the marker in herself. No name on it. She didn't need a name. She knew where he was. She stood at the grave for a long time after Garrett and Dex had gone, her hand on the marker, the wind moving through the grass around her. She didn't cry. She had cried everything out in the 3 days between his death and this moment. What she felt now was something quieter. A closing. A door she was shutting carefully with both hands, before turning to face what was ahead. She found out about the baby on a gray Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the hill. She was alone in the house. Edmund had gone to make his rounds, and she sat at the kitchen table for a long time afterward without moving. Her hand went to her stomach, flat and still beneath her palm. She thought about Cale. She thought about the way he had looked at the stars that last night, talking about Claude, Texas, like a man describing a place he had already half given up on. She thought about the stream and the cottonwood tree, and the light across the field in the morning. She thought about the way he had said, "That's where I'd want to end up." Not as a plan, but as a wish. The kind of wish a man makes when he doesn't believe wishes are for him. Her jaw tightened. She stood up from the table. She was not going to raise his child in the town that had killed him. She was not going to let his child grow up in the shadow of Edmund Voss's badge, and Edmund Voss's decisions, and Edmund Voss's version of justice. And she was not going to let Cale Darrow's only wish die with him in a Nebraska field. She had 1 week before she told anyone. She spent it preparing in secret, packing only what she could carry, selling her mother's silver brooch to a passing trader for enough coin to make the journey south, studying the roads. She did not write her father a letter. She had already said everything that needed saying. So Edmund came home on the 8th morning to find her gone. There was nothing on the table, no note, no explanation. Just a single thing left behind. The blanket she had brought to the hill on the night Kyle had told her about his dream. She had folded it and left it on her father's chair. Edmund Voss stood in the middle of his kitchen and looked at that folded blanket for a long time. Then he sat down heavily in the chair and put his face in his hands. Outside the window, Salt Creek went about its morning. The blacksmith's hammer, the creak of the general store door, the sound of horses on the main road. The town did not know yet that Nora Voss was gone. It would know by noon, and it would talk about it for years. But none of that talking would bring her back. Edmund knew that, though he had known it from the moment he gave the signal to his deputies in the dark. He had made his choice, and now she had made hers. The road south out of Nebraska was long and flat and cold in the early weeks of November. Nora rode with her coat pulled tight and her eyes on the horizon. She stopped at creeks to water her horse and ate sparingly from the supplies she had packed. Some nights, she slept under the open sky, wrapped in everything she had, the cold pressing down from above and the hard ground pressing up from below. She talked to Cale sometimes in the dark when there was no one to hear her. Not prayers exactly, more like continuing a conversation that hadn't finished. She told him about the road. She told him about the stars, which looked different this far south. Wider somehow, more generous. Why, she told him she was angry at him for not fighting harder, even though she knew that was not entirely fair. She told him she was going to find that field. She told him she was going to plant something in it. She told him she was going to teach their child his name and exactly what it meant, not the name the town of Salt Creek had given him, the feared man, the menace, the story people told to frighten each other. His real name. The name she had heard in his voice when he talked about streams and cottonwood trees and light on a field in the morning. She crossed into the Texas Panhandle on a bright Thursday in late November. The land changed gradually, the Nebraska flatness giving way to something wider, more open, the sky dropping lower and closer, like it wanted a better look at what was below it. Once she asked about Claude at a trading post and got directions from an old man who drew a map in the dust with his finger. She followed it for 2 more days, and then, on a Friday morning, with the sun just clearing the horizon behind her, she came over a small rise and stopped her horse. Below her, exactly as he had described it, was the field. Golden in the early light, wide and still, the grass moving in a slow wind that carried the smell of cold water. She could see the stream from where she sat, a thin, bright line cutting through the property, catching the sun. The cottonwood tree stood near the old barn exactly where he had said it would be, tall and solid, its bare November branches reaching up like open hands. Nora sat on her horse at the top of that rise for a long time. The sun climbed. The light moved across the field the way he had described it, slow and golden, like it had nowhere else to be. She pressed her hand against her stomach. She rode down into the field. She dismounted slowly, her boots finding the ground, the grass bending around her feet. She walked to the cottonwood tree and put her hand flat against its bark, rough and cold, and absolutely real. She stood there for a moment with her forehead against the tree and her eyes closed. The stream ran quietly nearby. The wind moved through the bare branches above her head. And in that stillness, with the morning light warming the back of her neck and his child growing quietly inside her, Nora Voss felt something shift in her chest, slow and deep, like a key turning in a lock that had been closed for a very long time. She was not healed. She would not be healed for a long time, maybe never completely. But she was here. She had found it. She had taken the one wish he had never believed was meant for him, and she had carried it all the way south, through the cold and the grief and the long, flat miles, and she had made it real. She lifted her head from the tree. She looked out across the field, his field, her field, their field. And she straightened her back, and she breathed in the cold Texas air, and she let it fill her completely. She was home. And that is where we leave Nora Voss. Not broken, not beaten, but standing in the middle of everything Cale Darrow ever dared to dream of, carrying his child and his name and every quiet truth he had ever trusted her with. He was feared by a town that never took the time to know him, but she knew him. And in the end, her love did what Salt Creek never could. It gave Cale Darrow exactly the ending he deserved. Not Ogallala. Not a nameless marker in a crowded field. A stream. A tree. A barn. And the light, warm and gold, meeting the field every single morning like it has something to prove. If this story moved you, if you felt something watching Nora ride south and refuse to look back, then you already understand what this channel is about. Stories that go deep, characters that feel real, emotions that stay with you long after the video ends. Hit that like button if Nora and Kyle earned it. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. And drop a comment. Tell me which moment hit you the hardest. I read every single one. Now tap on any of these 2 videos on your screen, and let's do this all over again.